Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Metropolitan Republican Club's webinar series. My name is Krisha Lenzo, and on behalf of the Met Club Board, we're so happy to have you join us tonight. As a reminder, we have a donation link in our live chat, and we hope you'll consider making a contribution to help support our club and continue to bring you content like this. So tonight, we are happy to have Adam Brandon, who's the president of FreedomWorks, join us this evening. FreedomWorks is a grassroots service center to millions of activists who support smaller government, lower taxes, free markets, personal liberty, and rule of law, which are so important in this day and age. Adam is the host of a new show, Save the Nation, on Newsmax on Sundays at 11 Eastern. And so you have to check it out, as well as a new father. So congratulations, Adam. In addition, he earned a BA from George Washington University, a master's degrees from Georgetown, George Washington University, and Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland. So tonight we will talk about some of the issues with Biden's administration, whether it's the stimulus plan, whether it's some of his other policies at the border, as well as just general grassroots programs in the United States and where the Republican Party is headed. So with that, Adam, welcome.
Thanks very much for having me. It's fun. I do wish we were doing this all in person, but hopefully in the next several weeks, months, we're going to be able to do that.
We do too, and we welcome you back to the club in New York. We would love to have more speakers in person, and we're starting to do that. So I think the end is in sight, knock on wood. But just to start off the interview with election integrity, I think as Republicans, it's one of the issues we really feel strongly about at this moment. So how can it be achieved going forward?
Well, one of the phrases I like to use on what happened in the last election, and I say this tongue in cheek, is that when I look in places like Pennsylvania and Georgia, I guess you could say they stole the election fair and square. And by what I mean by that is I like to compare Ohio, where I came from, grew up in Pennsylvania. In Ohio, on election night, we knew the owner, we knew the victor, we knew who received the electoral votes that evening. There wasn't really charges that anyone was not allowed to vote. It was very clear, very simple, very above board. Everyone, Republican, Democrat, trusted the result. You cross over the border into Pennsylvania, and it was a different story. There were questions. What did you need a signature on the ballot? When did the ballot arrive? And the courts were getting involved and just changing the rules. And I was just disgusted when I saw that for-profit corporations were donating money to put ballot box locations, drop boxes, only in certain places and not in others. But for me, every ballot has to count the same. And part of the ballot counting the same is every individual, every American citizen should have the exact same right to cast a ballot. And so when some people are given more rights than others, that to me is a violation of our ethics and how you should cast an election. So when I look back and go, how we go forward, if you go back to 2016, a majority of Democrats did not think that Donald Trump won the election. You go back to this last election, free and fairly. A majority of Republicans don't believe that Joe Biden won the election fairly. So you have the majority of Americans in the last two elections that don't believe in the integrity of the result. That is a crisis. That should be a bipartisan call that we should all take a step back and see what are these common sense solutions. And we did some polling. 79% of Americans, 79. I mean, what are 79% of Americans agreeing on right now? Believe that you should have voter ID. And that to me would do so much to help the system. And of course, I have this vision that you try and get back to the old system of people voting in person. I believe that is the safest system. I think back when I was a little child and I would go vote with my mom, I was like basically at her hip, and I remember she'd close the curtain behind her. My dad wasn't in the room. Her mother wasn't in the room. Her friends weren't in the room. That was her and her ballot. And I think that's what you need to start getting back to. The further you remove ourselves from that setting, the more the vote's going to be open for tampering. So again, I look at it, particularly maybe this bill, I don't know if you're going to ask about this, but the HR1 would gut our electoral system. And I start worrying. I mean, I'm a very optimistic person. But I start worrying, you start screwing around with the integrity of the voter system long enough. We can't go on for very many more cycles where people don't believe the outcome of the election. And the more, HR 1 would just institutionalize a lot of the problems that we saw the last cycle.
Well, that was exactly going to be my next question. So can you tell us a little bit more about the dangers of the HR 1, and the risks and unconstitutional mandates on the states?
So this is the second time HR 1 has been dropped. It was dropped in the last Congress, but it didn't go, Mitch McConnell didn't move it in the Senate. And there are so many different ways to start problems I have with this. Redistricting, the Constitution says states are allowed to figure out what their congressional districts look like. This would move that so it gets approved by the a court in Washington, D.C. That to me, that takes a lot of rights away from the states and drops it in the federal government. Federal funding for candidates, a 6-to-1 match if you get a certain number of small dollar giving. I can't believe that my tax dollars would start to go to fund candidates I absolutely abhor. Donor disclosure. And if you remember, the reason we have donor disclosure, it goes back to the civil rights movement where the NAACP was being harassed by certain southern states to turn over their donor rolls. And the Supreme Court came in and said, no, you can't do that because part of free speech is being able to give money to where you want to give money. This would start to do away with that. And when that happens, you're already starting to see these different sites that are identifying everyone who gave to Donald Trump. Why? So you could politically harass and intimidate them. Again, HR 1 starts ripping apart the basics of the system. It starts making certain things like the mail-in voting institutionalized. You can interpret the provisions that if you are on a government program, you will automatically get a ballot. Imagine that. It's kind of like you start having the situation where the more dependent on government you are, the more they're going to try and get you to vote. Well, that's a conflict of interest here. So HR 1, the only way they're going to pass it is if they break the filibuster. I think part of our job right now is to make it, if you're going to break the filibuster to pass this bill, you gotta pay one heck of a political price to do that. Now, if we win and we stop the bill, what they'll do is they'll end up breaking it up into like 20 different smaller bills and trying to move those through. But okay, survive and fight another day. But HR 1 should be, if you lose HR 1, if we lose on this one right now, we're looking at a fundamentally different election system in the next couple of years.
It really is shocking. And some of the results of our current election system, we're dealing with other conflicts of interest in the stimulus bill. So pivoting a little bit more to economics, what Biden passed recently is just going to put us at such a disadvantage for the future generations. So can you tell us about some of the long-term hazards that might result, from this crazy stimulus?
Okay, this is dangerous. So let's just round up a little bit, about $30 trillion are sitting on our national credit card right now, 30 trillion. There's still over $1 trillion left that hasn't been spent from the last bill. So now we just passed a $2 trillion bill. So basically in the next 6 months, you're going to drop 10% of our entire national debt on the US economy at once. And now you're starting to hear a $3 to $4 trillion bill that's going to be moving, that's going to be an infrastructure bill. But there's weird things in infrastructure bill about voting and all kinds of random things. This is where you're going to get your Green New Deal payments and things. So then now we're looking at $7 trillion moving. Our country is, you're looking at a $27 trillion GDP, and all of a sudden almost half of it, by the time you add up all the spending plus the other spending from the government this year, you could be moving close to $10 trillion through the economy. Now, you mentioned my master's degrees, most of those were in economics. And my economics textbooks, what a waste of a degree I got, because every book I read is now being thrown out of the window. This could end in tears. This is where you start. This is a massive dislocation in resources. You're going to have people running into investments that are crazy bad investments because there's so much cash rolling around. This could trigger inflation. We're being told, hey, don't worry about it. Inflation's under control. I don't know, folks. When I hear that many dollars searching for that few goods, this could end poorly. And eventually you're going to have to pay this money back either through higher taxes, which will come at the expense of growth, or you're going to monetize the debt, and we're all going to pay for it in a lower standard of living as we just debase the currency.
Well, we are only a few months into the Biden presidency, and there's already been so many radical changes.
And that's something that's very important. Folks, I have friends that used to tell me, Biden's your centrist. Biden's your down the road middle guy. Everyone can take a break. The stuff they're pushing, Barack Obama wouldn't have dreamed to move this stuff. This is as hardcore lefty as you're ever going to get. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I hope so. I hope you're, right. This is the furthest we'll go, but it doesn't even seem like that. I was going to say, what do you think are the next radical policies that are going to come out of this administration? Because literally anytime, tomorrow's his first press conference, which will be a disaster, as we all know, but curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, and I'm living in a scary world right now. Again, I'm usually an optimistic person, but let's just walk down this scary thing. You stop H.R. 1, you're already hearing about, we need to pass these things. You can't let Republicans slow us down. We need to get rid of the filibuster. Mm-hmm. If you get rid of the filibuster, my question to everyone who's watching is, why even have a Senate? What is the purpose of the U.S. Senate if you don't have a filibuster? It's just an upper house and a lower house. It really doesn't have a reason to even exist. Okay, you confirm people in the Senate. Well, you could just confirm them in the House. And this is part of a larger crisis that we're facing as we move from a republic, which is based on a system of laws and minority rights. So if you're not in the majority, that's okay. We have a system that's going to still continue to protect you, to a direct democracy. And in a direct democracy, 51% of the vote goes. And so you could start to do whatever you want as long as you have 51%. And even going back in history, Plato, when he wrote his book, The Republic, 2,000 years ago. I mean, I bet you didn't expect me to be talking about ancient Greece tonight.
I didn't, but I want to hear it.
Plato said in The Republic 2,000 years ago, before you have a tyranny, you have a direct democracy. Mm-hmm. That is a prerequisite to a tyranny. And before we got on this show, we were talking a little bit about my experiences living in Poland. Poland was not communist in 1945. Poland was communist in 1948 following an election. That's how they legitimized the communist role. It was through a very, I'm not going to say it wasn't rigged, but the pressure they put on the country for 3 years, they had this called the 3 S's, the 3 Talks campaign. You have to be very careful what you do when you have a pure democracy. So realistically, it's not the policy that I'm worried so much, because if you keep your institutions, you can come back and recover with policy. But let's say you break the filibuster to move in H.R. 1. All right, what's next? District of Columbia statehood. Okay, then Puerto Rico statehood, then maybe Virgin Islands statehood. Run them in, put them in there. And then you start there's a commission, folks. There's a commission that is meeting right now that is going to release its report around the 4th of July and on the Supreme Court. And let me give you a preview of what their recommendation is going to be: adding seats. They are going to recommend expanding the court systems, maybe adding an entire circuit court. For what purpose? To stack it in there. So that's what. Here's what I think we're really fighting. I'm an economics guy, and it's amazing we were talking about those trillions of dollars that's being spent, and what doesn't scare me the most is the economics. It's these other systematic changes.
Yep. So, obviously FreedomWorks, for those of you who don't know, I mentioned that it deals with grassroots campaigns, right, and wanting to hear about what grassroots organizations we can learn from you guys. How can we get involved to fight back?
Well, the most important thing is, like, and I get into this argument all the time with people, and you folks probably do too. Now, I know this is a group that has self-selected itself to be involved in the process, so this is not the highest argument to make to you guys, but I got into a big argument with my mother-in-law about this when she was like, politicians just don't listen. No, politicians very much so listen. In fact, if anyone's ever worked in a congressional office, some of the things, the first questions that the congressman or the senator is asking about, Okay, what are the phone calls coming in? But then they really want to know, what about people who have visited the office? That's where it gets really, everyone here, and I'm amazed when I travel around the country and I meet with activists and people think they're very involved, and I ask them, when's the last time you went and visited your senator's office? Well, I'm not going to fly all the way to Washington, D.C. Okay, right. But I guarantee you within 20 miles of your house, probably, maybe 50 miles, if you're in a rural area, there is going to be a local office of your congressman, of your senator. Now, visiting those offices is often more impactful than even visiting in D.C. because they are scared of the voter. That is the power that we have. We still have in our system. We have the power to stop all of these problems by making our voices heard. So like what we've been working on in places like West Virginia and Arizona, we just had a couple of rallies in West Virginia over the weekend where you would get people together. Sometimes they're not, doesn't have to be huge groups, 40, 50 people, but they are from Morgantown. They are from Charleston, West Virginia. And you get them to visit their local congressman, their local senator, particularly Manchin's office, and let them know how they feel. And now I'm seeing Manchin came out with a statement a few hours ago saying, well, we don't want to move on any of these massive voter reforms without having some Republican support. I can guarantee you, and I'm not going to say it was just FreedomWorks. I know there's other people who are doing this work. It's that pressure because Manchin's looking over his shoulder thinking his dream is to be, to run for governor again. He's not going to be able to run for governor if he pisses off all of his voters. That is our strength. Mm-hmm.
Well, the Democrats are pushing us more and more towards this one-party rule. As you said, it's become the tyranny of the majority. How can we stop this tidal wave and what appears to be a system that's either rigged or just completely disastrous against the Republicans?
So here's the optimistic numbers. And I'm going to quote the Washington Post. They did a good analysis, and what they showed, 90,000 votes. If 90,000 votes in this country would have been cast a different way, where would we be today? Republicans would have the White House, the House, and the Senate. There was 170 million votes cast, and only 90,000 votes. So to say we're getting our butts kicked and we're losing and the future is bleak, 90,000 folks, that's not that. I mean, it's not like you have to go back and reinvent the whole wheel. There is an article that I had it here on my desk. Okay. This is kind of a must read for everyone.
Yes, please tell us.
New York Magazine, David Shore, he wrote Why Trump Was Good for the GOP and How Democrats Can Win in 2020. David Shore is a self-proclaimed socialist who worked for Obama, who is a data guy, and he crunched the numbers. And what he found, it was stunning. And what he said is that if you look at this last election, Democrats should panic because they were hemorrhaging Hispanic voters. And the percentage of Black voters who flipped from Democrat to Republican was also statistically significant. And what he says is that what's interesting in America today, whites are becoming the most liberal, college-educated whites are becoming the most liberal progressives in America. So you have these very wealthy, college-educated white folks who are now starting to say what the Black community and the Hispanic community needs. And the Black and the Hispanic community are thinking, we just hit lowest unemployment rates in history in 2019. You've got particularly, the statistics, and this is not going to shock anyone. If you're a Hispanic of Colombian or you're a Hispanic of Venezuelan descent, you wholeheartedly flipped votes to the Republican Party from 2016 to this last election. And so it's interesting to me, and where my biggest optimism is, and even I have to look back at how I talk to audiences and how I approach my issues, because sometimes I just get into numbers. It's where our opportunity is as the Democratic Party grows more ultra wealthy, ultra educated, white liberal. It is completely opening up a brand new segment. We can talk to Hispanics, Black and other minorities unlike we ever have before. That is our opportunity right now. That's our way forward. And if we seize the momentum of these moments, we're going to prosper. And I think the reason why Democrats are so focused on breaking the institutions right now is if trends continue. This article kind of says it looks like that the left is not going to slow down. I mean, defund the police. Do you know who gets pissed off the most on defund the police? Are poor folks living in crime-ridden neighborhoods.
Exactly.
I mean, we've got school choice on our side. We've got, you've got those issues on our side. Now is our time to go into those to those communities. That's where our margin of victory is going to come in the future. That's where I'm getting. Even if you did add Puerto Rico and DC, as much as that's going to damage, the system, and I don't like that concept, I think our message is even going to win in those places. I think our message in Puerto Rico wins faster than people think, and I think as DC even changes a little bit, you may have some opportunities there. I mean, the problem with DC is it's just so government related. A small government, limited government message doesn't work as well. But some of these others, they better be careful if they throw in Puerto Rico as a new state.
Well, you touched on it, but this year we all experienced the fragility of freedom, and a lot of this was due to the virus, and the Democrats kind of used that as a power grab. Can you explain your take on it and how, we've had such a lockdown and also the stifling of our freedom of speech? It's been overwhelming.
So, COVID is a pandemic. COVID's really bad. I'm not going to say it isn't, but I think if you go back in time, back to March, I remember smart people that I was listening to, that I was trying to lift up their voices, were saying, hey, we need to protect the nursing homes. We know who is the most vulnerable in society. Let's go and protect those people and have some other basic, some of this, I think Florida's done quite well. I mean, they still, it's not like it's just the way it was a few years ago. I mean, I was just in Florida. You're still taking certain precautions, but you could have done such a better job by absolutely protecting the most vulnerable and then letting the rest of society continue to function. Mm-hmm. I mean, what we did to our school kids, I mean, it's hard for me not to use a 4-letter word right now. The damage we have done to our children is just incalculable. For what? Yes, you are going to find kids who die of COVID, but I've seen numbers that's like 8 times, 10 times more children under age of 18 are going to die of the flu than of COVID. So you start stacking up where this actually is, the damage that we've done. I mean, we need to have a truth commission when this is all done, so this never happens again. I mean, thank God this wasn't the Spanish flu that actually was killing people who were perfectly healthy. I mean, we knew exactly who was most at risk, and we failed to. I mean, just look at what Governor Cuomo did. I mean, the exact worst policy you could do is the one that he embraced. Sending people back into these nursing homes. So, but the loss, I mean, I'm very concerned. I mean, one of the things I'm most concerned about is at the very beginning of COVID, people were saying, okay, this free cash is a bad idea. And I'm very disappointed this last go around. People are like, all right, the free cash isn't such a bad thing. And I worry that if we as a country start to become dependent on these different handouts, like, I worry about the next recession. Is this going to be part of the government toolkit? We have 8% unemployment and, we're in a recession. So free checks for everyone. If that's the case, I don't want to say that we're going to become Venezuela, but we certainly are looking like we could become Argentina. And that is not, I mean, Argentina's I love Malbec wine as much as the next one. but that's not what the United States is. And I think that this is new opportunities. I think some of those suburban women we've lost, those suburban women have been on the front lines of having to have a 6 and an 8-year-old that are bored as heck running around their house, while teachers are saying we can't send our kid, it's too dangerous. And then we find out these teacher unions they're sending their kids to private schools. Right. So, I think that we do have to have a little sit down, a little huddle with our entire country and talk about, these rights and liberties that we have. Do you really want to give them up? Because, it could be great, but if for a little while, but eventually you don't want to be so dependent on the government for our basic needs. And I worry that we may be crossing over into that late Roman Republic style bread and circus because of COVID.
Certainly. And it's our fear as well with our local government in New York, especially. We've been very adamant and, push forward, the fact that Cuomo has really done, to your point, the worst possible job he could do. And the media really propelled him. So it's been really, really hard to see.
I would argue it's criminal. It's almost criminal. Like
it really is.
Hands for the policies. And by the way, and you know what's also criminal? Remember when you had like the hospital ships show up in New York City, and they were basically said, "No, we don't need them." I mean, I just don't get me started on this. This is it's embarrassing. It's sad. It's criminal.
And that's why we turn to you, because, as a leader at FreedomWorks and grassroots organizations, wanting to hear about some of the accomplishments you guys are doing and, what you've been able to change.
So what we're looking at this year, I think the opportunity, number one, is we have to stop the worst of the worst things. So right now, our activist community is fully engaged in HR 1. And when people ask, well, what is the size of your community? We have over 5 million folks on Facebook, hundreds of thousands on Twitter, hundreds of thousands on Instagram. And if it's a social media platform where people gather, we tend to have an imprint there. And then on the other side, the face-to-face work, which is by far the most fun. Since 2016, we've had over 100,000 people come through our training sessions. And before COVID, we were doing 3 a week. And now we're doing a lot of it on Zoom, but we're in places like Florida and Texas right now. We have a fly-in this weekend on another issue that we're going to be getting on offense on, and that's school choice. And basically, what we're seeing right now is we could talk to a wider audience than we've ever talked to about school education. We're calling it education freedom. There's a lot of people who aren't conservative, aren't Republican, aren't libertarian, but they're really ticked off of what they saw. And they're starting to see what their kids are learning in school, and they're not so sure that this is such a great idea. So I think we're getting into a new era of parent empowerment. And I want to be there with our activist community to help these people to try and push back on these school boards. So it's stopping bad legislation. It's going to be trying to see what we can get done, some positive change on education freedom. And then finally, we're going to be working in several states where we have an opportunity to kind of change some of the laws to really make sure that what we saw screwing around with elections never happens again. I keep going back to Pennsylvania. I cannot believe they were changing election law in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of an election. Ballots were going out and they're changing election law. You need to make sure that never happens again. I mean, that is straight out of I don't know, like 1984 and Atlas Shrugged combined in a novel. That's it absolutely is.
Yeah.
So I think those are the three, the things that we're going to be doing this year. And then heading into next year, we start getting ready for politics and the political side of my organization, which, by the way, talk about politics for a second. The Census Bureau is not releasing the new congressional districts until later in the year, probably September, which means we're not going to know by the time you have the court cases and everything else. You might not know the congressional districts until next spring. And then you got to file and you got to get signatures and start running a campaign. I mean, I don't understand what could possibly be holding the Census Bureau up besides malfeasance.
Certainly. And we have more questions from our audience. So I'm going to turn it over. Some people wrote to us in advance. We have some people in the comments. But someone writes, how can we hold people more accountable, and what grassroots efforts can be made to this goal of accountability versus political advancement and self-enrichment? And that's something, you touched upon in terms of the conflicts of interest, but I guess wanting to expound upon that.
Well, if there was the main takeaway, it's like trying to challenge everyone to not just go visit, even if it's a Democrat, even if you live in AOC's district, go visit their local offices and drag a friend or two with you. I mean, that is possibly, it sounds so simple, but in today's climate, that's what cuts through. And that kind of scares politics. I always open up a speech with the joke, like, what's a politician's number one job? And everyone knows the punchline: to get reelected. Yeah. So that's one of the best things that people can do. I like to, think that particularly on the FreedomWorks Facebook page, we help give people information. I like to think that on our, on this, our Sunday show, we're trying to build a community that way. But I mean, whether people want to get involved in my organization, which I'm kind of partial to, or any organization, fine. Just make sure you're getting yourself involved in, but please put pressure on your elected officials. And congressmen don't like it when you visit their office, but your local folks, they never get a phone call. They never get a visit. You show up at a local person's office, that scares them to death. So the more you actually show up and you get other people to show up, it's the single strongest thing you can do.
And they're scaring us with their policies, so we can scare them a little bit.
That's right. That's right. Because they think if you show up, there's 100 like you that they don't see. So
sure.
That's important they see you. And by the left shows up, that's why the left scares the heck out of congressmen so often, is the teachers unions show up, everyone shows, those folks show up. And when people show up, it changes they get scared. So if they see the other side, it changes an opinion.
Well, someone wrote in earlier asking about your predictions for the future of the Republican Party. Obviously, that's a broad question, but wanting to hear a little bit about your thoughts on that.
My short, medium, and long term. Again, when you only lost the elections by 90,000 votes, I'm not so sure you're going to see a wholesale change necessarily overnight. You look at the long-term trends, though. Again, I think I mentioned this earlier. If you are college-educated white folks tend to gravitate in. I think it was a 7-point or 10-point shift. I mean, that's one hell of a delta in an election. But your future really is with the biggest up for grabs group is Hispanic Americans. Mm-hmm. They are so weakly wedded to the Democrat majority, the Democratic Party, that it would be fairly easy to bring them over. I think you do need to get smarter in how you talk about certain issues with different audiences. I mean, that's something that I tried to explain to, my dad. What motivates him doesn't motivate me. But I'm glad we have his vote but I think what you look at is, the message is very important on things like Kristen Sinema won her Arizona Senate seat because she was really good at Instagram. And the image that she conveyed on Instagram is why she won. And so I think as a movement, as a party, we have to get much more sophisticated in these mediums and how we use them. I am always amazed how many congressional races I see don't have a Facebook campaign going. It's like, are you kidding me? Where this is? Okay. So I think it's the techniques and how you message. Mm-hmm. But again, I think it's some of the ways that I look at things. Like, look, I read Atlas Shrugged as a young man, and that's what made me very motivated. I think that my desire to shrink the state may not be matched by, may not be an electorally winning message, but I know 90% of my message can get across. So I think it's looking at if you're, not just trying to make myself feel good and argue ideologically on pure, but try to understand, because the one thing the left gets is they get these slices of the loaf. So I believe part of the future is starting to adapt that. Is like, how do we start moving things closer to our our vision? Mm-hmm. And again, and if we start doing that, we have new voters we can bring in, and it's quite possible. And this is still a center-right country. The DNA in the country is still center-right. So we have a natural advantage, and that's what I think the upcoming years are going to be about grabbing. And by the way, one thing I point out the election, I think if you look at a huge percentage, I didn't see the last numbers, but I think in the 15 races, House races we were working in, 11 of those that flipped were women and minorities. And that to me is so exciting. And because part of that is if you bring more women, more Hispanic, more, this is, think about it, just a few years ago, you had 0 Black Republicans. Now you have Senator Scott, Burgess Owens out in Utah. I mean, you're starting to get a wide variety of folks. I'm a big fan of Maria Salazar out of the Miami area, greatest in the election cycle. Mm-hmm. That's our future, folks. And I'm really excited about that future.
Well, you're very prescient, because one of the next questions was, who are you excited about in the Republican Party, and some of the most effective people right now. So maybe it's not the future, but who right now is our biggest advocate in government?
Well, there's a lot of different ways. I think I just mentioned some of those. So there's a congresswoman out of South Carolina named Nancy Mace, who I'm very impressed with her. This new crop of freshmen is really, these are dynamic, exciting, passionate, committed, principled folks. So I'm very excited about them. And then I look around at some of the other states, and there's two governors that are standing out to me. Kristi Noem out in South Dakota, and Governor DeSantis, because in the middle of the pandemic panic, they looked at the data. I was in a meeting with Kristi Noem, and I asked her, you got bludgeoned. What was your thinking? And she's like, she was seeing the rise in COVID rates. And then she was looking, but what she was looking at was the hospital beds, the ICUs. Mm. And that number is the one that she was looking at, because it wasn't that she didn't care if people got COVID. What she cared about is, if you had COVID and you had a serious condition, were you going to be able to get treatment in a hospital? And so that's why she watched that number. So while CNN is having Cuomo on TV freaking out about total cases in her state, she's looking at it being like, we can match what we need to do here. And then she actually told me, though, that the guidelines she was given, this is South Dakota, everyone in the small town would have to shut down except the giant Walmart on the outskirts. And she just thought that wasn't right. And then she was telling me, where were the biggest outbreaks? They were all in the meat processing plants. No one was shutting down the meat processing plants. No one was going to do that. The country would starve to death if you started shutting those things down. So her whole point was, they were going to stay open anyway. So why would I, shut those down? And why am I going to shut down other people? And you know what? They, their caseload may be technically higher, but if you look at all the other results, they did, their economy, stayed intact. And I think overall, she did a great job. And then, of course, DeSantis down in Florida, I think he's doing a great job managing the crisis as he sees it. And, in Florida it's doing all right. So I look at those governors. I look at some of these freshmen that are coming through. And I'm pretty excited. That gives me a lot of optimism. And even in, I think one thing that we need to do, and again, this is about reaching new audiences, I'm getting sick of not trying to compete in places like New York and California. Mm-hmm. And we picked up a lot of congressional seats in places like California. And I think that there is an opportunity going forward, again, as this rich elite, white folks continue to get super, super liberal. Yeah. That creates new markets for us, and that gives me optimism.
We are also very sick of it in New York. And I think that maybe is a lot of interest about FreedomWorks and how to get involved. So I don't think we touched on it. When and how did you start FreedomWorks?
No. So I've been at FreedomWorks now for 16 years. And what happened to me is I thought I was going to run for office back in Ohio, and I went to work on a campaign, and I'm like, forget this. I have no desire to be an elected official. I get it. And I left, and I went to work at a small nonprofit where I kind of took some time off. And I kind of reread some of the books that really inspired me at the beginning of why I believe in liberty. And so FreedomWorks was open, and I was looking at their website, and it was all the economic issues. And that's that's my DNA. I'm a growth guy. So there's a press job, and that was 16 years ago. And then 6 years ago, and every single time I went to leave, like I got my degree in finance and all that, a new position opened up for me. And then finally 6 years ago, my boss decided he was going to go in a different direction, and the board asked me if I'd like to, run the company. And I thought, are you kidding me? This is like asking someone to come out of the back of the plane to fly the plane. I had no clue how to run a nonprofit organization. I was the executive vice president, but they worked with me, and we've had great growth. We raised almost $19 million last year, which was one of our strongest years in history. And I feel very, very lucky, very blessed to have this job. And I plan to do it for a while here, because a lot of these, I want to be around to help kind of this next. I look at in DC right now, the Chamber of Commerce used to be very conservative. Now they give to Democrats as well. Then you look at, some of the other networks, some of the other organizations are changing. I mean, like the NRA went bankrupt. And so I think there's this whole sea change that's happening. And I think that activist groups are going to be more in demand than think tanks, because I think people are looking at the stakes right now and they want to get involved. We know we're right. It's like, how do you get involved? So it's a real honor and pleasure to be working at an organization that does grassroots. And so I feel very lucky. And
another, item on your agenda, obviously, Save the Nation. Can you tell us a little bit about your new show on Newsmax?
So it was funny, as I had originally I was not going to be the host. I had another guy who was going to be the host. And a few days before that we went to air, there was a conflict with another television network. So he couldn't do it. And I have a limited budget. So this is how this stuff goes. I sank my budget into production, into cameras and staff. I had no money left for talent. So it's like, I guess I got to do this. And the hardest thing for me is you've got to read off of a teleprompter. But folks, I'm dyslexic. And so reading off of a teleprompter is not an easy thing for me to do at all. And but we figured it out, and it's a lot of fun, because I'm now, in the minute that I decided, okay, I will run the show, there's some stories I want to tell. And my goal with this is to learn how, like we were talking about the border, and one of the untold stories about the border, think about this: 80% of all the women who are crossing the border have been sexually assaulted on their journey. 80%.
Incredible. It's awful.
So what I'm getting sick of is that the left always tries to argue like they are the holier than thou folks. Like, we're doing this for migrants. Okay, you are pushing a system that is almost guaranteeing that a woman is going to be sexually assaulted. Are you kidding me? This is their policy that is encouraging that. To me, we have the moral high ground. And I look at a lot of different issues. We talk about COVID. I want to start, I think on this week's show, we're trying to get some folks on, some small business folks who have lost their businesses. And if we can't do it this week, we'll do it, going forward. But I want to start telling those stories to kind of help people get the moral high ground. And my goal too, I am a numbers guy, so I'm not just going to go out there and slash and burn in a monologue. I'm hoping that you're going to hear a number. And I'm hoping people today are walking away from, when someone says, you guys, the reason you want a border wall is you hate minorities. It's like, did you know that 80% of women are sexually assaulted crossing that border? And I think I want to start to help arm people, because the only way we're going to win is if people are able to kind of make these facts are great, but these moral arguments are stronger and you back up those moral arguments with facts.
Definitely. And the data, though, and also, as we've seen with these citizen journalists, and we've had James O'Keefe on and different people on, and just getting these people on tape too, because they'll spin it no matter which way,
I think, again, you're talking about groups of the future. I think what like O'Keefe is doing is just gutsy as hell. I love what he does.
Me too.
Because when you start having people like, basically saying like, yeah, let me help you commit voter fraud, that story helps. And even if you're not into social issues or things like that, you start, he gets into Planned Parenthood, and some of the stuff they're saying is just cringeworthy. So I think that's part of, we don't have control of the media, obviously that someone else is telling our story, and this is why it's important to make sure that we're using social media effectively, because, and yeah, I do worry about getting banned and all. That's a whole nother conversation. But I think it's when you're able to get our videos out and use these different platforms and ways, that's how we're really going to expand our base and our reach.
Adam Branham, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm going to take you up on the offer. I do want to come up to New York. I love New York City.
Oh, please.
My wife and I got engaged in New York City.
Okay.
So it's kind of a place we always like to go. And if I have one place I like to go for a celebratory dinner, I always love going to Keen's and getting a mutton chop. That is like my favorite thing. And then having like 17 scotches afterwards. You know, that's a good night.
Well, come visit us on the Met Club on the Upper East Side anytime. Obviously, you're part of our family, but we want to become more involved in FreedomWorks and what you're doing. So, can you give us your handles and ways to reach you and how to get involved?
Sure.
And we'll of course put this in the chat as well.
Sure. So, I mean, it's freedomworks.org, and we don't like our website right now, and you won't either, but that's okay because we're rebuilding it as we speak. We're actually going to make it more like a newspaper than what it is. I would say that the Facebook is by far our most active community. Facebook is always showing us that sometimes we've had the most active political community in the United States. On it, but I'm at Adam_Brandon, and so I will talk some politics and probably a little too much Cleveland sports on Twitter. And but I think those are great ways to kind of find us. And then of course, would be a lot of fun is 11 a.m. Newsmax, Save the Nation. And you can always reach out, and I'd love to, if you have ideas for shows, like, look, if there's a New York City angle that needs to be told, I would love to help to tell it.
Oh, we have a lot of angles, so we'll definitely let you know. But thank you so much for your time. I learned a ton, really interesting facts and ways that we can arm ourselves against the left. So really important.
Yeah, so just don't sell yourself short. You getting involved in going to visit a congressman or your senator, it has more impact than you could ever know.
100%. And on that note, thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Take care.
Thanks.